Thank you so much, Patricia, for that gracious introduction, and thanks to the audience for the warm welcome. In addition to thanking Patricia for the almost 3 years that we have been working on this event, I would also like to thank Karen Fisher, who has been very, very helpful with the arrangements. And it is thrilling to finally be able to deliver this important lecture. As Patricia said, despite the intervening time, developments have made the topic only more relevant. I'd like you to note again the title of my 2018 book, which Patricia referred to. You may not be able to see it, but the big ugly word there is hate, and the superscript over it is why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. Notice that the only verb in that title is resist. So my overriding goal and my overriding message is counteracting hatred and the associated discrimination and violence associated with hatred. So I strongly support the very same goals that prompt calls to censor so-called hate speech. And I put it in quotes because it is not a legal term of art. As I'll discuss, it is an inherently subjective concept. But I strongly support the very same goals that animate calls to censor it: equality, dignity, diversity, inclusivity, societal harmony. That's quite a mouthful, so I'll summarize that interrelated set of goals by just one word: equality. I oppose censoring hate speech because the evidence shows that no matter how well intended, censorship is at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive to advancing those very important goals. So I'm going to make 3 major interrelated points. First, I'm just going to, I'm so sorry, I meant to start my self-censorship device there. I want to leave plenty of time for audience interaction and Q&A. So I'm going to make 3 major interrelated points. First, I'm just going to list them, and then I will briefly explain them. So first, contrary to much misunderstanding, robust free speech principles do not absolutely protect all hate speech. Rather, these principles rightly allow government to restrict the hateful speech that is the most dangerous. Point number 2, beyond these appropriately limited restrictions, censorship that goes any further is not effective in promoting equality, and to the contrary, may well be counterproductive. Third, non-censorial measures are more effective in promoting equality. So those are the 3 major points in a nutshell. Now let me proceed to explain them, starting with point number 1. Contrary to much misunderstanding, robust free speech principles do not absolutely protect all hate speech. Rather, they rightly allow government to restrict the hate speech that is the most dangerous. That's specifically true for the free speech principles under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which I will be citing by way of example. But I want to note at the outset that the core First Amendment principles overlap with those of many other legal systems. Most importantly, they overlap with the international human rights law of free speech under major United Nations treaties to which almost every country in the world is a party. Moreover, many international human rights advocates have agreed that these same key free speech principles should also apply to powerful private sector entities, such as online platforms, which Patricia had asked me to specifically focus on, and I agree with her, are especially important as a forum for either enjoying free speech or not enjoying free speech. And in fact, these key First Amendment principles, which are also replicated in the UN principles, are in fact the ones that have been used by Facebook's, now known as Meta's, quasi-independent oversight board that you might have heard about. So in short, I will be referring to First Amendment principles, but I want you to understand that these principles are universal. So I am citing the First Amendment only as illustrative. Many critics of these principles attack a straw person, a distorted version of the First Amendment, because they claim that the First Amendment absolutely protects hate speech with no exceptions. And my response to that is not. To be sure, government may never restrict any speech based solely on its content, its viewpoint, its message, its ideas. Even if the content is deeply despised, even by the vast majority of us, in our democratic republic, it is not for the government to pick and choose which ideas will be aired. Rather, it's up to each of us to decide which messages we do or do not want to listen to, respond to, refute, debate, or ignore. However, when we get beyond the content of the speech and we consider speech in its overall context, government may restrict speech, including hate speech, in particular facts and circumstances. In a nutshell, government may restrict speech if it directly causes or threatens certain specific, serious, imminent harm, such as violence. In other words, if the speech restriction is necessary to advance an important public interest goal, such as preventing imminent violence. A shorthand label for this concept is the emergency principle. And again, that is recognized in United Nations law every bit as much as it is in First Amendment law in our country. The Supreme Court has recognized several categories of speech that satisfy the emergency standard, all of which apply to much hate speech. One example, you may have heard this term, is so-called fighting words. That's a direct personal insult that's likely to provoke a violent reaction when addressed to the ordinary person. And I think that that is a concept that most people have in mind when they think of hate speech that should be punished. So I'm here to tell you that if that standard is satisfied, that is hate speech that in that particular context, because of the danger that it's likely to provoke a fight, not solely because of disagreement with its viewpoint, then it may be punished, consistent with First Amendment law. So imagine, for example, a demonstration of white supremacists, and there are Black Lives Matter counter demonstrators, or vice versa, and there's a face-to-face confrontation using hateful words. That could be punishable as fighting words. Another example of a category of speech that satisfies the emergency principle that would apply to much hateful speech, and again, this will probably sound familiar. This one has been talked about a lot since January 6th of last year. Intentional incitement of imminent violence that is likely to happen imminently. Another example that sadly was satisfied by tragic development in this country in 2017, I'm thinking of the white supremacist, the Unite the Right demonstration in Charlottesville, is a so-called true threat. And that is when the speaker intends to instill a reasonable fear on the part of the audience member that they are going to be subject to imminent attack. And interestingly enough, the speaker doesn't have to intend to carry out the attack just to instill the fear, because if I fear that I'm going to be subject to attack, and let's say I'm a counter demonstrator in Charlottesville, that's already going to inhibit my freedom of movement and my freedom of speech. So I can use the Charlottesville example to illustrate the critical distinction between hate speech that is constitutionally protected because of this content neutrality principle that I described, viewpoint neutrality. Government can't punish speech solely because of disapproval, even loathing of the content, versus the emergency principle when the speech in all the facts and circumstances constitutes, for example, a true threat. So when the Unite the Right demonstrators in Charlottesville were chanting their odious, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us," horrible messages, but our loathing for those messages alone does not justify punishing it. Then put those messages in the overall context that we saw on the Friday night before the scheduled rally, and you have them not only saying those words, but marching en masse with lighted tiki torches that they are brandishing menacingly close to counter demonstrators who are ringed around the Thomas Jefferson statue on campus. That constitutes a punishable true threat. Another example of hateful speech that would satisfy the emergency standard is targeted harassment or bullying. So to recap, the First Amendment permits speech restrictions consistent with the emergency principle. We have many examples, too many examples of hateful speech in our society that can and should be punished, completely consistent with that principle. So I reserve the term censorship, which signifies unconstitutional, inappropriate speech restrictions, for speech restrictions that the First Amendment does not permit because they don't satisfy the emergency standard. And in other words, when the speech is restricted either solely because of disagreement with its content or because it has a more loose, speculative, indirect connection to potential harm that falls short of the emergency principle. So that brings me to my second major point, that censorship that goes beyond the emergency standard is not effective in promoting equality, and it may well be counterproductive. Countries around the world that censor hate speech still experience not only high levels of hate speech, but also high levels of actual discriminatory conduct, including violence. Germany is a particularly poignant, tragic example, given Germany's history with the Holocaust, and I should tell you that I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor who, astoundingly, my father was performing slave labor in the Buchenwald concentration camp and almost was murdered by the Nazis. In fact, I'm so proud of my father. He was a teenager when he was incarcerated in Buchenwald. He was born in Berlin in 1922, and as a teenager he was committed anti-Nazi, and because of his political views as well as his Jewish heritage, he was considered doubly undesirable. And you probably know that in addition to committing genocide through gas chambers and other direct methods of murder, the Nazis also engaged in eugenocide, sterilizing undesirables. Well, my father, as a double undesirable, literally had an appointment to be sterilized. And one day before he was going to be sterilized, Buchenwald was liberated by American forces, and I still get chills every time I think about that. So I always want to thank members of the American military who are defending freedom and human rights every bit as much as I try to do in different ways. So Germany, I continue to be particularly concerned about what's happening there. Germany has some of the strictest anti-hate speech laws in the world, which are very strictly enforced. And for those of us who follow it closely, there have been many tragic circumstances of violence in Germany against Jews, against immigrants, against refugees. In fact, there have been so many attacks on Jews that a couple of years ago, while she was still head of state, Angela Merkel, for the very first time in German history, felt it necessary to appoint a cabinet-level minister for anti-Semitism. And a couple of years ago, that minister, along with a rabbi who heads the Association of Jewish Communities Surviving Jews in Germany, issued a declaration saying that it is not safe everywhere in Germany for Jewish men to go out in public wearing the yarmulke, the skull cap that many observant male Jews feel it is their religious responsibility to wear. Why? Because when you self-identify as a Jew, you are exposing yourself to attack, and that has been happening, unfortunately, with great frequency, despite the very strict anti-hate speech laws in Germany. Now, to be sure, the United States also experiences too many such problems. Hateful speech, hateful actions, hate-motivated violence. But the greatest strides that we have made in this country toward reducing those problems have coincided with our greatest strides toward protecting free speech, including for hate speech. In particular, it was during the 20th century civil rights movement that the Supreme Court began to strongly enforce First Amendment rights for the first time. You know, like many of the great freedoms, including the right to equal protection of the laws itself, these had existed on the books for a very long time, but were not honored in reality. And that's exactly why organizations such as the ACLU and the NAACP and others were formed, because these rights, as James Madison, who penned many of them, famously said, you know, they are only parchment barriers between individuals and government abuse. Words on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment that are not self-executing. And so the Supreme Court began to really put teeth into First Amendment free speech rights as well as equality rights at the same time during the civil rights movement of the mid and second half of the 20th century. And this was not a coincidence that these two sets of rights were enforced at the same time. The Southern officials who opposed the civil rights movement relied on censorship to stifle not only the civil rights activists themselves, but also the national media that were essential for covering the cause and for raising support for it in the rest of the country. Not surprisingly, Martin Luther King and other civil rights crusaders strongly opposed censorship, including of hate speech. Among other reasons, they were painfully aware that their speech was constantly stifled and punished under all available laws. After all, remember Martin Luther King wrote that famous, eloquent letter from a Birmingham jail. Why was he in jail? Everybody knows that he was imprisoned, but how many of us know what his crime was? He was being punished for trying to exercise what we now consider to be fundamentally important, constitutionally protected free speech, the right to peacefully protest government policies that are unjust and inconsistent with the Constitution itself. Now, throughout U.S. history, all movements for equal human rights have consistently been suppressed by censorship until the Supreme Court began to strongly protect free speech, consistent with the emergency standard. For example, at least as far back as the 19th century, there were courageous, pioneering advocates of everything from gay rights to women's rights, not to mention racial justice, reproductive rights, long before these movements actually gained any real traction. A key development that made the difference was meaningful protection of free speech. Indeed, some historians say that was the key development. I could cite many examples, but I'm going to confine myself to one for now. A very respected law professor named Dale Carpenter, who was a hero of the marriage equality fight. And here's how he put this point in a 2019 Law Review article. It is no stretch to say that the First Amendment created gay America. The freedoms it guarantees protected gay cultural and political institutions from state regulation designed to impose a contrary vision of the good life. Gay organizations and media would have been swept away in the absence of a strong and particularly libertarian First Amendment. No other constitutional right helped us more. In short, the point I'm making is that there's not even a correlation between censoring hate speech and promoting equality, let alone a causal relationship. Laws censoring hate speech have accompanied the rise of hatred, as we see in Germany, and the absence of such censorship has accompanied the rise of equality, as we see in this country. When we do a logical analysis about the potential impact of censorship laws, we see that these patterns make sense. Even if we assume that a censorship law would completely stop some hateful speakers from engaging in hate speech, such a law clearly would not suppress all such speech. After all, even in the most authoritarian regimes, government has never succeeded in totally silencing any targeted speech. I could cite countless examples, but Patricia asked me to comment on giant tech platforms in particular, and that's such an important topic. So let me take this opportunity to do that. Last year, the Wall Street Journal ran a series called The Facebook Files, based on internal Facebook documents that were released by whistleblower Frances Haugen. These articles highlighted the futility of trying to stamp out all hateful speech or any problematic speech. The title of one of these articles says it all. Facebook says AI will clean up the platform. Its own engineers have doubts. And the subtitle, AI has only minimal success in removing hate speech, violent images, and other problem content, according to internal company reports. Specifically, the article reported that AI has been able to remove only a sliver of the posts that violate Facebook's rules in the low single digits. Last year, the report was that AI had removed posts that were generating only about 4% of the hate speech views. And when it comes to violent and inciting expression, only 0.6% of the content that violated Facebook's policies was targeted. One of Facebook's own data scientists wrote that despite Facebook's intense investment in removing banned content, its success rate was dismal. He added, "We might be the very best in the world at it, but even the best in the world isn't good enough to find a fraction of it." So if this is the best that Facebook can accomplish with its unparalleled AI technology and its armies of human content moderators, it's not surprising that hate speech laws in the offline world fare even worse. I'd like to bolster this point, the futility of trying to eradicate hate speech or other controversial speech, with a very recent article from The Forward, which also focused on tech platforms. This is from just 1 month ago. It was entitled, "When Trump's Supporters Gave Him the Finger, Was It Really a Nazi Salute?" Now, this question was prompted by a Trump rally in Ohio, where thousands of his supporters thrust their index fingers into the air. As the article explained, that gesture could reference a hate group or conspiracy theory, But that's also true for countless other words, gestures, symbols, and so forth. Here's what the article said. New hateful gestures are invented almost constantly within the bowels of the internet as part of the churn of memes and nested references that comprise internet culture. Sometimes even people in the know can miss the reference. By the time a symbol is recognizable to more casual followers, it will be near the end of its life. Plus, hate symbols are designed to look innocuous and to be hard to track. That's how they escape notice from algorithmic filters and teams screening social media for hate speech. Hate speech, as listed in the Anti-Defamation League's database, includes such seemingly innocuous terms as 100%, which white supremacists use to reference the idea of a completely white society. And other numbers can also be hate symbols, including 1, 2, 12, 13, and 14. If you're curious about the coded hate messages, you can just Google those numbers and you'll find out. I'm going to give you just one more example. Coors, a major brand of beer, can also stand for comrades of our racial struggle. As the article concluded, none of this means that every time politicians point at the ceiling, they're referencing a hate group or a conspiracy theory, but it means they might be. So, major problem here. Even beyond this problem, the constant proliferation, the constant morphing of words and memes to convey certain problematic ideas, there's a further reason why censorship can't suppress those ideas. That's because the ideas are also conveyed indirectly through the aggregated impact of multifarious oblique references. Communications scholar Curiae George well explained this phenomenon, citing both hate speech and another controversial type of speech that's also often targeted for censorship, namely disinformation. He wrote, "The most powerful fake news deceptions are not usually made up of neatly self-contained messages. For example, the well-documented misperception among most Americans that crime has been rising cannot be attributed solely to election candidates' pants-on-fire lies, but is also due to factual but selective reporting by news media, as well as fictional depiction of violence in entertainment media. Similarly, hate campaigns comprise disaggregated collections of historical narratives, tropes about being and belonging, stereotypes about the other, and curated streams of news and opinion that reinforce favored ideologies. Viewed singly, most of these messages will not cross any regulatory threshold. It is in the audience's heads that they combine to harmful effect. So given this diffuse and pervasive nature of problematic speech, George concludes that censoring it is doomed to fail. Instead, he concluded, much more attention needs to be paid to the demand side of disinformation and hate campaigns. As Patricia and I were talking about, the teaching of information literacy, right? In sum then, for the reasons I've just recited, a censorship law will not completely silence hate speech. Instead, logically, a censorship law can have one of three possible impacts, none of which is helpful to the equality cause. First, some such speech is going to be driven underground. Second, some such speech is going to be camouflaged in more subtle language to evade censorship. And third, some such speech is going to persist and even be ramped up. In the first scenario, where hate speech is driven underground, it's going to be harder to monitor and respond to it. Anti-hate activists won't be able to try to change the speaker's mind or to dissuade others from adopting the speaker's views. Law enforcement won't be able to monitor hate mongers who might be planning violent or other illegal actions, so it will be harder to detect, deter, and punish such actions. In the second scenario, some hateful speech is going to be camouflaged in more nuanced language to evade the censorship laws. These messages are more pernicious because they're more attractive to more people than the cruder hate speech that the laws single out. Third and finally, we continually see that some hate mongers brazenly defy censorship laws despite the risk of prosecution. Prosecuting and punishing the speakers is hardly likely to change their attitudes. Worse yet, it garners attention and even sympathy, which is why they defy the laws and actually welcome prosecution due to the well-documented so-called forbidden fruits phenomenon. And I confess, every fall we celebrate something called Banned Books or Freedom to Read Week, and I get the list of the books that are banned and I immediately buy them, and many of them shoot to the top of the bestseller list. This is a major reason that anti-hate experts oppose censorship. Organizations such as the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, which are committed, their overriding mission is to combating hate, and precisely because censorship is likely to do more harm than good, they oppose it. I'm going to give you an example from another campus exactly 1 week ago today. Pennsylvania State University. You may have seen there was an event that was hosted by a student organization called Uncensored America, featuring Proud Boys, that's a right-wing organization, Proud Boys founder Gavin McGinnis. It was canceled shortly before it was due to begin due to the threat of escalating violence from demonstrators on both sides. The president of the university issued a statement in which he condemned the violence on both sides, and he stressed how the violence and the cancellation ended up reinforcing the Proud Boys' messages. Here's what he said. The Proud Boys will celebrate a victory for being canceled. They contributed to the very violence that compromised their ability to speak. Counter-protesters also will celebrate it as a victory that they forced the university to cancel this event, when in actuality they have furthered the visibility of the very cause they oppose. So in sum, the censorial approach isn't effective in promoting equality, and it may well even be counterproductive by amplifying the hateful message rather than muting it. Worse yet, there's another way in which censorship is even more counterproductive, and that is that it disproportionately silences minority voices and views. And that's why these laws are opposed by so many human rights activists from many different countries and many international agencies. My book cites many of them. Let me just give you one quote from the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which said, "In many countries, hate speech rules are abused by the powerful to limit non-traditional, dissenting, critical, or minority voices or discussion about challenging social issues. Hate speech laws, ironically, are often employed to suppress the very minorities they purportedly are designed to protect." Now, beyond all the anecdotal examples, I think it's really important for you to understand why this pattern is no coincidence. The concept of hate speech is irredeemably subjective and vague, right? Hate is an emotion. What one person considers to be the most hateful idea, somebody else cherishes as a loving idea. I could give you countless examples. I'm sure you've observed it from seeing how the term is profligately used. I mean, some powerful politicians have accused Black Lives Matter of advocating hateful ideas. They say it's hate speech against white people or hate speech against police officers. Other people argue that Blue Lives Matter is hate speech, or All Lives Matter is hate speech. I have seen signs that say free speech is hate speech. I mean, the only thing that these accusations have in common is that the stigmatizing term hate speech is used to describe an idea that the person using the term hates. So basically, when we hand over this subjective discretionary power to an enforcing authority, we can predict that that power is going to be exercised in a way that comports with the powerful interests in the community, the majoritarian interests, and to the disadvantage of those who are challenging the status quo, who are advocating on behalf of minority causes or groups. So now let me sum up my second major point, which is that censorship is never going to eliminate hate speech or even to meaningfully reduce it. So we clearly need alternative measures to counter its potential adverse impact. And I'm going to, I see I'm kind of running out of time, so rather than saying more on that point, I'm happy to answer any questions about it. I'm going to quickly segue to the third point, which is what are the effective alternative strategies that are more effective as well as consistent with the First Amendment. So hate speech, censoring hate speech, when you think about it, is a prohibition strategy. It's seeking to dry up the supply and the consumption of a dangerous item, in this case controversial speech, by punishing those who supply and consume it. As with other famously failed prohibition strategies, such as the war on drugs, experts concur that punitive supply-side efforts are futile. Rather, the most constructive response is to reduce people's demand for the targeted item and also to reduce its harmful impact on them. So in the case of hate speech, the demand-side harm reduction strategy is persuading people not to listen to it, or if they do listen, to reject its message and resist any potential harmful impact it could have. So, for example, mental health experts say that all of us can be trained to be resilient in the face of speech that is potentially upsetting, insulting, and even traumatizing, such as hate speech. As I can give you many examples that I have been tracing through the years I've been studying this, of even leaders, former leaders of hateful organizations, white supremacist organizations and Nazi organizations, have been redeemed. That's the term that they use. It's got religious connotations, not by being punished, not by being shamed and shunned and ostracized, but rather by being reached out to with compassion for them as human beings, not compassion for their ideas, by incredibly patient people who engage in prolonged one-on-one conversations, including online, gradually getting these people to question their own views and to change their own hearts and minds. There are many memoirs that have been written, TED Talks that have been given, very, very persuasive and moving. And we have entire organizations, including one that's based in Chicago called Life After Hate, which consists of nothing but former leaders and activists in hateful organizations that have been redeemed through that kind of exchange. And they usually say that they have done so much harm, they think they can never undo it, but they want to dedicate the rest of their lives to by trying to interact with others who are in these organizations, who are flirting with going in that direction. And one final example that has to do with disinformation, and that is critical media skills, that so we can all learn to recognize disinformation and hence to discount it. We're not going to get rid of all disinformation any more than we're going to get rid of all hate speech, even if we had the strictest censorship laws. So, why is it that Alternative strategies such as engaging in discussion with hate mongers or providing us with critical media skills and resiliency in the face of hate speech. Why is it that these are more effective? It's because by definition, censorship is a superficial strategy. Censorship focuses on expression. It is an inherently superficial, quick fix which ignores the real problems. The real problems are, number one, people's underlying attitudes, right? We want to change hearts and minds. We don't just want to change what they say. And we're also concerned about the resulting actions if people actually engage in discriminatory or violent conduct. So more meaningful and effective strategies focus on both the attitudes and the actions. And let me say that when I started the research for my book, and it was a topic that I had been researching and studying my entire life, but I tried my best to always be open-minded. Let me put on my little prop here. This is for one of my heroes, John Stuart Mill. Don't get excited. It's not a MAGA hat. For those who see it, it says, "Make J.S. Mill great again," and that stands for John Stuart, who wrote the great, I think still the classic and most persuasive defense of free speech in 1859 called On Liberty. But here I want to insert a very important parenthetical. He himself credited his wife, Harriet Taylor, with effectively being a co-author of that work. And I think it's really important to recognize that and to salute her, a woman in the 19th century who contributed to one of the enduring classics of human liberty. And they were both also pioneers in the cause of women's rights. But, in the spirit of John Stuart Mill, even the most cherished idea that we hold should be subject to questioning and re-examination. And so truly, to the very best of my human ability, I have been open-minded, and if I saw evidence that additional censorship power beyond the emergency principle would be effective in advancing equality, I would support it. Much more importantly than me supporting it, if the United States Supreme Court saw evidence that additional censorial power would advance equality, that would survive First Amendment scrutiny. But I have not found that evidence. To the contrary, looking at how hate speech laws are functioning in other countries and how they are critiqued by human rights activists in other countries, I find them even less effective and more dangerous than before I began working on the book. That's the downside, but as an activist, I'm a congenital optimist, so the glass much more than half full. On the other hand, I found the evidence about the efficacy of non-censorial strategies to be so much more encouraging and constantly proliferating. And these include everything from passing and strongly enforcing anti-discrimination laws, laws against so-called hate crimes, as opposed to hate speech. I told you that's not a constitutionally recognized concept, but a hate crime is. That's when an action that would independently be a crime, such as an assault or vandalism, the victim is singled out for an intentionally discriminatory reason. The Supreme Court has held, and the ACLU has supported this holding, that can be treated as a more serious crime because it does more harm to the victim and to the victim's community and to the larger society. So that's a very important strategy that we use. Also, recently, some of you may have noticed that in the wake of the Charlottesville tragedy, a conspiracy lawsuit was successfully brought against individuals and organizations that led the horrific violence, and with evidence showing that it was planned in advance, and with millions and millions of dollars of damages designed to bankrupt those individuals and entities. And then I also alluded to something that's called counter speech, which basically means any way that we can raise our voices to support the victims, to proactively educate in favor of equality values and against the hateful values. I want to quote the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. This is really important because in the European countries, their legal standards are different, and they do allow what we would consider censorship of hate speech in this country, and for reasons completely apart from free speech concerns, but completely having to do with what is an effective strategy for counteracting hatred. ECRI, that's the acronym, issued a report a few years ago in which it said counter speech is much more likely to be effective, much more likely to be effective than censorship. Well, I have only a couple of minutes left on my self-censorship device here, so I'm going to tell you that if you're interested in what I would suggest we do to deal with social media, I would entertain a question about that. In a nutshell, let me just say that along with other cyber libertarians, my goal for social media would be the same as it is for other media, and that is user empowerment, user agency, freedom of choice for all of us. We should not be subject to some centralized gatekeeping control, whether it be rendered by the government or whether it be controlled by a tech titan. And technologists who work in this area say that there are ways that, using a term interoperability, that third parties should be allowed to superimpose different filtering options onto the major social media platforms so that each of us could choose the kind of moderation standards that we wanted, rather than being subject to a one-size-fits-all. So that's the bottom line conclusion. But there are very, very difficult issues here, because as a matter of First Amendment law, not only are the social media companies as private sector entities not required to respect our free speech rights, the First Amendment only directly binds the government itself. Moreover, as communications entities, they have their own First Amendment rights to make editorial decisions about what speech and speakers they will host and which they will not. And I'm very nervous about government getting too involved in that process. On the other hand, as a practical matter, having this unaccountable power in the hands of these tech giants, which are not subject to control. Whoops, talk about censorship device. Okay, I hear you. Let me just finish the sentence. So these are very, very difficult issues that are wending their way through the courts right now, and clearly will go to the Supreme Court. I think the legal journalist Emily Bazelon put this very well when she said, do we really want to trust a handful of chief executives with policing spaces that have become essential parts of democratic discourse? We are uncomfortable with government doing it. We are uncomfortable with Silicon Valley doing it. But we are also uncomfortable with nobody doing it. This is a hard place to be, or perhaps two rocks and a hard place. So in conclusion, I just want to urge all of us who care so much about equality and want to resist hate to raise our voices to do that. It will make an enormous difference. I quote many, many human rights activists and leaders in my book making that point. But I'll end with Martin Luther King, who says, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So I'd like to thank all of you friends for not remaining silent. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. This should be on. Is it amplified? Yes, thank you. I wanted to get out from behind the podium for the Q&A. A very, very important question, and fortunately, to the best of my knowledge, no university has mandated trigger warnings. Individual faculty members have a right to choose to issue them. But I think the real problem in universities is a more subtle and therefore a more difficult one to challenge, because if there were a hate speech code, outlawing certain expression or mandating trigger warnings, the ACLU, FIRE, Speech First, many other organizations would go to court and successfully have them stricken down under the First Amendment. Every single hate speech code that has been on college campuses that has been challenged has been struck down as either unduly vague or overbroad. And I'm very proud that the ACLU brought the first of those lawsuits many years ago when hate speech codes were new at the University of Michigan. But the problem that we face now, and I'd be curious whether people here believe it exists at Marshall. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but surveys have been done of campuses all over the country which consistently show that substantial majorities of members of the community, faculty and students, all across the ideological spectrum of every demographic group, are engaging in massive self-censorship for fear of saying something that somebody will perceive as offensive or insensitive, even if unwittingly so, leading to disproportionate punishment. Viral social media campaigns of shaming and shunning and ostracizing, and even calling for the firing of somebody or as a faculty member or the expulsion of a student. And there's you can't go to court and bring a First Amendment lawsuit against self-censorship, right? And interestingly enough, I'm very proud as a faculty member that surveys show that students are not afraid of their professors punishing them. They're afraid of peer pressure. This reminds me, last week my mother-in-law, God bless her, turned 102. By the way, she was also a Jew in Nazi Germany. My husband documented that she would have been killed at the age of 19, along with all the other Jews in her city, except she had a Zionist aunt who helped the family escape to what was then Palestine. I digress. She turned 102, and I sent her a joke. She's in fine mental form. And the joke that somebody had sent to me is, what is one of the best things about being 102? Answer, very little peer pressure. Unfortunately, that is not the situation on campus. And so much has been written about this. I was discussing with Patricia, a young friend of mine who's an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, just published an essay. And the University of Chicago is very celebrated justly for having adopted very speech protective principles in 2015, having faculty and administration that's very much in support of free speech. But my friend Olivia says it doesn't matter. She and her friends, no matter how supportive they are of free speech, are afraid of the adverse consequences if they say something that's unpopular. And she said before she raises her hand in class or even says something in a social setting, she asks herself, is it worth it? So it's that kind of culture, that the culture of fear, understandable and rational fear, because people's lives have been ruined. We have to start developing a culture that nourishes and encourages the robust exchange of ideas. And there are many initiatives that are going on in many campuses to do that. So thank you for that excellent question. So excellent question about algorithms on social media, siloing us and shielding us from certain ideas, and just exposing us to whatever ideas are selected by the algorithm. I couldn't agree with you more that that's a serious problem, and that would be a kind of regulation that I think I could support. The only reason I say I think is this is also complicated. I want to retain an open mind. But I think that we, from what evidence can be gleaned, because these companies are engaged in such massive secrecy and absence of transparency, I can rely on what leaks out through whistleblowers. I'm also thinking of a fantastic book by Shoshana Zuboff at MIT. I can't remember the name of the book now, but she talks surveillance capitalism, right? That these companies not only are not telling us how they are steering us, we are being manipulated. It's the opposite. I've said my ideal is user agency, user freedom of choice, but it's the opposite. We are probably being manipulated in ways that we're not even aware of, let alone consenting to. And so I think some kind of content neutral requirement of, number one, radical transparency about what the algorithmic options are. Number two, user consent, that we can choose what kind of filtering we want. And number three, that could be provided by other third parties, not only by the powerful tech companies themselves. Thank you all. Great questions.